The forest was still. The first frost of winter had settled over the landscape like a fine dusting of powdered sugar, turning every leaf, twig, and rock into glistening sculptures. Ethan, a wildlife photographer with a passion for capturing the untouched beauty of nature, moved quietly through the woods, his breath visible in the chilly air. He was in his element now, alone with the trees, the silence, and the occasional crunch of snow beneath his boots. His camera was his only companion, a trusted tool that allowed him to freeze moments in time, moments that most people never had the privilege of witnessing. But as the world around him lay still and quiet, there was an unfamiliar sound, a high-pitched cry that broke through the thick silence. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The sound wasn't natural, certainly not the call of a bird or the wind rustling through the trees. It was something else. Something desperate. The cry was full of pain, a cry that echoed through the cold, making his instincts spring into action. He moved cautiously toward the sound, his camera bag swinging by his side. The forest, which had been so peaceful moments before, now felt charged with tension. Every snap of a twig underfoot seemed louder than usual. As Ethan advanced, his breath coming faster, the cry came again, closer this time, sharp and urgent. It was almost as if it was calling to him. Through the thicket of trees, he finally spotted the source. A small bear cub, no older than a few months, stood trembling on the snow-covered ground. Its fur, dark but matted, shimmered with the frost. Its wide, frightened eyes locked onto Ethan's, and with a soft whimper, it limped toward him, its tiny paws leaving small prints in the snow. Ethan's breath hitched. He knelt slowly, his hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. "Hey there, little one," he whispered softly, not sure if the cub could understand him, but somehow hoping that his calm presence would reassure it. The cub stumbled forward, reaching out with one paw, lightly tugging at his pant leg, as if asking for help. Suddenly, there was movement from the edge of the forest, a dark shape emerging from the trees. Ethan's heart sank. He knew exactly what it was, the mother bear. Her protective instincts would be in full force if she saw him too close to her cub. But there was something different. The mother bear wasn't charging at him in fury as he expected. Instead, she was struggling, her powerful frame dragging behind her, one of her legs pinned beneath the trunk of a massive fallen tree. She was weakened, her breath ragged and slow, her eyes filled with pain and desperation. Her growl was low, a warning, but it was laced with exhaustion. Ethan's gaze moved between the mother and the cub. The cub was still at his feet, looking up at him with wide, trusting eyes, as if it was urging him to help. Without thinking, Ethan set down his camera, his pulse racing. He had to act fast. The winter was unforgiving, and without help, the bear family wouldn't survive. He assessed the situation quickly. The fallen log was enormous, too heavy for him to move alone. Ethan's mind raced, grasping for a solution. He reached into his pack, pulling out a small saw he carried for just such emergencies. It was a tool meant for cutting firewood, but it was all he had. The cub, realizing what Ethan was doing, stayed close, its eyes never leaving him. The mother bear remained still, watching him, her expression unreadable. Ethan began to saw into the log, the teeth of the saw biting into the thick wood. It was slow work, but with each stroke, he felt a sense of purpose, a sense of urgency that propelled him forward. The temperature seemed to drop as the minutes passed. Ethan's hands were numb from the cold, but he pushed through, focusing entirely on the task at hand. The forest around him was eerily quiet, as if even the wind had stopped to watch. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the log began to splinter. With one final push, Ethan managed to shift the heavy trunk just enough to free the bear's leg. The mother bear let out a deep, groaning exhale, slowly rising to her feet. She winced, her injured leg dragging slightly, but she stood. Her gaze, though wary, was no longer filled with hostility. Ethan took a cautious step back, not daring to move too fast. For a moment, the two of them, man and bear, stood in a strange understanding, locked in the wild silence of the forest. The cub, seeing its mother free, immediately ran to her, rubbing against her side. Ethan smiled softly, a quiet relief washing over him. They were safe, for now. The mother bear didn't move toward him. Instead, she gave him a long, slow look. Ethan sensed a silent acknowledgement, perhaps of gratitude, or perhaps simply of mutual respect. She then turned, and with the cub trailing behind her, she disappeared into the trees. Ethan stood there for a long moment, watching them go, feeling the weight of the wilderness around him. He slowly made his way back to his campsite, feeling a deep sense of connection to these creatures of the wild. But as night fell and the fire crackled in front of him, Ethan couldn't shake the image of the mother bear's injured leg and the vulnerability of the cub. He knew that they might not survive the harsh winter without help. The thought gnawed at him. The next morning, as a light snow began to fall, Ethan couldn't let it go. He packed his medical supplies and a few fish he had caught earlier. He had to go back. He couldn't leave them to fend for themselves. He trekked through the forest once more, this time with a sense of purpose. The woods were still quiet, save for the occasional rustle of snowflakes drifting from the branches. It wasn't long before he found them again. The cub spotted him first, bounding through the snow, its little paws leaving deep prints. The mother bear was resting beneath the trees, her leg elevated, but she looked at him warily, a soft growl rumbling in her throat. Ethan set down the fish a safe distance away, giving them space to come to him. He spoke gently, trying to calm the mother. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to help." The cub, seemingly unafraid, went straight for the fish. The mother bear, after a long pause, sniffed at the fish, then took a tentative bite. Ethan approached slowly, his movements deliberate. He opened his medical kit, pulling out some antiseptic and gauze. His hands were shaking slightly, but he knew he had to act quickly. Carefully, he cleaned the wound on the bear's leg, applying the ointment with precision. She let out a soft growl but didn't try to stop him. Ethan wrapped the leg carefully, making sure to secure it without causing further discomfort. The cub, now curious, nuzzled his leg, pawing at his camera strap. Ethan smiled at the playful gesture, reassured that at least the cub was healing in more than just body. Over the next few days, Ethan returned to check on the bear family, bringing food and monitoring the mother's recovery. The bond between them began to deepen. The mother bear no longer growled at his approach, instead, she observed him carefully, her eyes watchful but not threatening. The cub grew more playful, circling him, tugging at his equipment, and even trying to climb into his lap as if seeking affection. But Ethan knew that this relationship couldn't last forever. The bears needed to regain their independence. They needed to be prepared for the winter ahead. So, with a heavy heart, he made the decision to make his final visit to ensure the mother was able to walk on her own. On the last day, Ethan approached the clearing. The mother bear was standing on all fours, testing her leg. It wasn't fully healed, but it was strong enough to support her now. The cub ran to meet him, its fur fluffier and its movements more coordinated. Ethan knelt down, smiling at the cub, who immediately tried to steal his camera bag. The mother bear watched them from a distance, and this time, there was no sign of aggression, only quiet acceptance. Ethan knew it was time. Slowly, he backed away, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this was the last time he would see them. But as he turned to leave, the mother bear approached him, her massive head lowering in what could only be described as a gesture of gratitude. With a final look, the bear family disappeared into the forest, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick blanket of snow. Ethan stood there for a long time, a mix of emotions swirling inside him. He had helped them, but now they were ready to face the world on their own. As the days passed, Ethan continued his work in the wilderness. His photos, now imbued with a deep sense of connection, went viral. His story of the bear family inspired people to rethink their relationship with nature and to embrace the wild with compassion and understanding. But despite the fame, Ethan knew that the greatest reward was the bond he had shared with the bears. And so, he often returned to the woods, hoping for one more glimpse of the mother and cub, hoping that his small act of kindness would echo in the wild. Years later, on a crisp autumn morning, Ethan found himself at the edge of the meadow, his heart racing as he saw them. The mother bear, strong and regal, stood proudly in the sunlight, her once injured leg now fully healed. Beside her, the cub, now a young adult, bounded toward him, full of energy and life. Ethan's heart swelled. The family had survived. They had thrived. And in that moment, he knew that the bond they had shared would live on forever, a story of compassion and trust written into the very fabric of the wild. The cub circled his legs again, as if to say, "Remember me?" Ethan smiled, knowing that this was a bond that would never fade. As the years passed, Ethan continued his work in the wilderness, his life marked by the quiet beauty of nature. His photos, now showcased in galleries and magazines, spoke of more than just wildlife, they told the stories of connection and compassion. Yet, despite the recognition, there was always a part of him that yearned for the simplicity of the wild, for the untold stories in the woods. One autumn, after a particularly busy season, Ethan found himself in the same woods once again, this time with a greater sense of purpose. His heart had been drawn to the forest for a long time, but it was more than just the need to capture another image. There was a quiet longing within him, a desire to reconnect with the bear family he had once helped. The forest greeted him as it always had, with whispers of wind, soft rustling of leaves, and the faint scent of pine. The landscape had changed, as all things do with the passage of time, but there was something about it that felt familiar. Ethan felt his heart beat slow as he made his way down the well-worn path, following the same route he had taken all those years ago. The snow had just begun to settle, a fine dust of frost covering the ground, but the trees were still alive with color. Golds and reds danced in the canopy above him, and the world was crisp and clean. The silence was almost profound, broken only by the occasional crunch of his boots in the snow. He paused near the clearing where he had first encountered the bear family. The air was still, and for a long moment, Ethan simply stood there, listening to the soft sounds of the forest. He hadn't come for a photograph this time, he had come for something else, a closure, perhaps, or just the need to feel the presence of the wild once more. It wasn't long before he saw them, the same dark shape moving through the trees. At first, Ethan hesitated, wondering if his memories were playing tricks on him. But as he watched, the shape grew clearer. The mother bear was there, her fur now thick and grizzled with age, but still as powerful as ever. Beside her was the cub, no longer a cub, but a strong, young bear with a confident stride. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The bond that had begun so long ago, in those early days of winter, was still alive. The mother bear approached, her eyes steady and calm. The young bear, now grown, bounded around her in playful circles, still as full of energy as it had been when it was a cub. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a warm glow over the trio. Ethan stood completely still, not daring to move, as if fearing that the moment would vanish if he did. His heart was full. He could see that the family had thrived, had healed, and that they were as much a part of the wild as the wild was a part of them. The mother bear, though cautious, made her way toward him, her movements slow but purposeful. She stopped a few paces away, her gaze unflinching. Ethan lowered himself to a crouch, his heart pounding, but he stayed calm, his eyes never leaving hers. The young bear watched from a distance, curious but cautious, just as it had been all those years ago. There was a deep sense of understanding between Ethan and the bears now, a quiet recognition that neither had to speak. This was no longer a story of rescue or survival, it was a story of respect and mutual trust. As Ethan stood up, the young bear hesitated but then took a step forward, its eyes softening. Ethan reached into his bag, retrieving the camera he'd carried with him. But he didn't raise it to his eye. Instead, he just held it loosely, the lens facing the ground. This wasn't about capturing a moment, it was about simply being present. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of the forest, the earthy smell of moss, the crispness of the air, the faint musk of the bears. Ethan stood there for a long time, letting the quiet of the forest fill him. His eyes moved from the mother to the young bear, his chest swelling with emotion. This was a moment he would carry with him forever. The cub, now grown into a young adult, took a few more steps closer, sniffing the air curiously. Ethan lowered his hand to the ground, palm open, in a gesture of friendship. The young bear paused, then nudged his hand lightly with its snout, a simple act of connection, of recognition. The mother bear, watching carefully, gave a low grunt, a sound that might have been interpreted as approval. With a final glance, she turned and disappeared into the trees, the young bear following her. Ethan watched them go, his heart full, knowing that the forest had a way of healing itself, just as he had witnessed it in this small, yet profound, chapter of his life. Ethan returned to his work, but something within him had changed. His photos, once filled with a sense of detachment from the wilderness, now carried a deeper meaning. He no longer just captured the beauty of nature, he became a part of it. His work began to reflect the delicate balance of life and the responsibility humanity held in preserving that balance. His story with the bear family had become more than just a moment, it had become a legacy. People who saw his photos began to understand the human-wildlife connection in a way they never had before. Ethan's tale of the mother bear, her cub, and their bond inspired countless individuals to approach nature not as something to be controlled, but as something to be respected and nurtured. And so, each year, Ethan would return to the forest, hoping to catch a glimpse of the bears, to reaffirm the bond that had shaped his life. As the seasons passed, the wilderness continued to change, just as he did, but the memory of that first encounter, that first act of kindness, would always be with him. As the camera pans out, Ethan